Good evening, everyone. I'm Michelle Gray, the Director of Programming for the New York Times live conversation and performance series, TimesTalks, which pairs New York Times journalists with the brightest and boldest creative minds from the fields of film, theatre, music, art, fashion, literature, and science. I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's events with three masters of the stage and screen. Tony Award-winning Director of Theatre, Opera, and Film, Julie Taymor, Academy Award nominee and Golden Globe-winning actor Clive Owen, and Tony and Obie Award-winning playwright David Henry Hwang. In conversation with the New York Times theater reporter Michael Paulson, the trio will discuss Hwang's modern classic M. Butterfly, which charts the scandalous romance between a married French diplomat and a mysterious Chinese opera singer, a remarkable love story of international espionage and personal betrayal. The play opened on October 26th. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Michael Paulson, David Henry Hwang, Julie Taymor, and Clive Owen.
So hello. Thank you all for being here. And thanks to all of you who are watching on Facebook Live. For those of you who are new to TimesTalks, the ritual is we will talk, I will ask questions for about 40 minutes, and then it's your turn. We'll have about 20 minutes for Q&A, and as always, we will ask you to phrase questions in the form of questions. So I'm guessing that many of you are familiar with the story of M. Butterfly in one fashion or another. Maybe you saw the original production, maybe you've seen the revival, maybe you saw the film, but just in case, David, why don't we start with you? Can you just remind us what this story is about?
Right. Well, this all started at a cocktail party about 30 plus years ago. It's the type of story one would hear at a cocktail party. Somebody said, oh, did you hear about the French diplomat who had a 20-year affair with a Chinese actress who turned out to be a spy and physically male, and the diplomat claimed that he never knew the true gender of his lover.
And on it goes. Well, we're going to start by showing you all a little series of clips from the revival so you can see what it looks like, and then we'll talk about it. So why don't we roll the video?
I sit night after night watching our story play through my head. One where she returns at last to my arms, for I have known and been loved by the perfect woman.
So, Clive Owen, how did you first encounter M. Butterfly?
The usual way, really. I got sent the play. I didn't know the play at all.
You did not see the original?
No, I didn't see the original. I didn't know the play at all. And Julie contacted me and asked if I'd be interested in doing it. And I read it, and read it again, and read it again, and read it. And there was just something so striking about it. And then discovered that it was, you know, a true story, and a book had been written about the people. And it was one of those things that I couldn't then get it out of my mind. I just found it such an intriguing, complex, strange, wonderful love story. And so I met with Julie, and I was a big fan of her work, and it seemed like the obvious thing to say yes.
Yeah. And what about, why did you want to be on the stage? Obviously, you work a lot in film. This is 8 times a week. This
I
is
wasn't particularly looking to do. I mean, I did a lot of theatre when I started out. I trained at RADA, and my first passion was theatre. And I hadn't done a play. I did Old Times here a couple of years ago, and that was the first play in 13 years. And I was very scared. You know, it'd been a long time, and you know, everyone says, "Oh, but you did such a lot when you were younger," but you don't know. You forget what energy it takes. You forget the discipline of it. And so it was a big deal, sort of coming back to do a play. And it wasn't that I was particularly looking to do a play, but I've spent my whole career being prepared to go where the good work is, whatever that is. And it wasn't that, you know, I was looking to do a play. It's just that it was such a great piece of writing, and I was set alight by it, and I wanted to do it.
Right. Julie, I know you did see the original production, and you loved it. What made you want to take this on as a revival?
My discussions with David, because I did see it 30 years ago, and I have the vague memory of the beauty of the set and what it was basically about, and the reveal at the end. You know, it's not like I remembered a lot, but when I reread the script, or read the script actually, I was intrigued to see if David was interested to actually open it up. And I wasn't interested. He knows this. He knows this now.
I know this now. I didn't know this at the time.
No, because I wouldn't have said that. I was
Very
polite.
Yeah, great.
But I turned it down. and then I was sort of asked to really why? And I said, okay, well, let me do some research. And I started to look into where he had been, what had inspired David, and a lot more material had come out since the play, since his great success. And when I started to look at what the information that you can find now online about these two people, it's extraordinary. I'm sure we'll get into it, but it blew my mind, frankly. I thought it was so contemporary, even though it's still set in the 60s, 70s, 80s, but it was so wild and actually made it much more today, the concerns. And I also felt that for me, the original, he said he thought it was a great love story. I thought it needed to be more developed as a love story. And here's a very successful, brilliant writer who's willing to go, okay, let's go at it. And that's extraordinary. A living, successful playwright with a successful play that's willing to open it up and really get into the characters. I felt that Song Li-ling and Gallimard both needed to be more developed, and that there could be aspects of Chinese culture that should be developed as well, so that the audience would see the environment that both of these characters were in, and what moved them, and the mystery of it, and the details of the Cultural Revolution. So that was it. It was that David said, I'll go on this journey with you.
It's interesting because I think of you as primarily associated with new work, but it sounds like you approach this as if it could be a new work again.
Yes, but I also have done classics.
Right.
But any director who does Shakespeare and the Greeks and all of that, you do approach that as new work, because that's sort of what the directors do. The guy's dead, why not? You know. Right. But I love directing Shakespeare, so I'm in love with great writing, and it's wonderful to have someone who's there with you, who's living, who can toss it around and spar with you, and really make something fresh out of something that already was good. It's a metamorphosis of his classic.
David, I wanted to ask you about where this all came from, and I brought a little show and tell. If we could show the first slide. This is the page from the New York Times in May of, help me out, I don't even know what year.
Is it 85? Is it 86?
88, maybe?
No, it wouldn't be 88.
Anyway, this is the story that I believe you saw.
Yeah.
Tell me about reading this story and kind of what about it said to you, oh, this could be a drama.
Right, so there was a cocktail party, and then I was trying to find out more about the actual story, and there was this on page 27 or something like that of the Times, and one column. And this was, of course, before the internet. I think there was one newsstand that sold foreign papers, and you had to wait a few weeks for them to show up. Anyway, it ended up not being really possible to find out more about the actual case. So basically, I just made everything up. And and that worked out fine. But in this sort of reverse meta situation, because the show was successful, as Julie was saying, there was a lot more attention that started to be paid to the actual protagonist that inspired the story. And Barbara Walters went to Paris, and there was this book written. And so I knew about all this at the time that that the play was still running, but it was only when we began to talk that I started to think about, it would actually be really great. And there's a reason that I've been sort of postponing reviving this play for almost 30 years, and it's because I wanted the play to have, first of all, I thought I wanted the production to have a sort of freshness and a reinvention that could hopefully engage with the culture on some level similar to what we were able to do the first time around. And then I realized, no, I want to go back into the script and look at some of this new material. And you don't want to rewrite everything that that one did when one was younger. But I think the litmus test is, am I excited about doing this? Does it make my heart beat faster to start to re-engage with these characters? And I found that once I started to do that, and I started to work on the rewrite, that it was I felt incredibly exciting and liberating, and that I still had more to say about this story.
Right. I want to ask you a little more about the original. The play, of course, is called M. Butterfly. Very early on, you saw that newspaper story, and in your head, you associated it with a famous opera, Madama Butterfly. Tell me about that you had concerns about. Tell me about how those related.
Well, so how could the diplomat not have known the gender of his lover? And so I thought about this story for a year, and at some point the answer came to me, he probably thought he'd found his version of Madame Butterfly. And at that point, the idea of dovetailing the events of the spy story and the plot of Madame Butterfly seemed like a really interesting way to get at this material. So I figured, okay, at the beginning of the play, the Frenchman would fantasize that he was Pinkerton, the American lieutenant from the opera Madame Butterfly, and that he'd found his butterfly, and that by the end of the play, the Frenchman would realize that it's actually he who was Butterfly, and the Chinese spy was therefore the real Pinkerton. And once I knew that, I could start writing the play, and that led to the original play.
Right. Now that you were the first Asian American playwright to be produced on Broadway, is that right?
Yeah.
And the first to win a Tony Award. Congratulations.
Thank you.
I gather that you have concerns about the way the opera is framed and sort of what that tells us about how we see relations between the East and West that you hope to address through this.
Right, so Madame Butterfly felt like the right metaphor for me. Actually, at the time that I came up with this idea, I had actually never heard Madame Butterfly, the real opera. So I just I was living in LA and I was in a car at the time, and I drove into a record store and bought a box set and read the libretto. And of course, it had everything I needed in it. Because I would argue that Madame Butterfly is really the template for East-West romances and East-West relationships throughout most mediums in the 20th century of works that come out from the West, whether you look at the Clavel novels or Rambo even. There's just a series of this trope seems to keep being replayed. And so therefore I also believe that it reflects on some level the way that the West looks at the East, even to the extent of influencing our policymakers when they make decisions about the world.
So all three of you are now working on what is a fictionalization of real events. How do you think about how closely you need to hew to the actual what happened, and how much you can veer into creating your own characters and your own stories?
I think ultimately I feel I can only use the real facts for inspiration for a jumping off point. Yes, I just sort of made up everything the first time, and this time I was inspired by a few more things that had come out since the original play. But essentially, the play has to work as a play. The story arcs have to work, the characters have to be clear, and so that's why you can't really just go, okay, well, I'm going to do this, and it's true, and therefore it's going to be a good play. You can, I think, only use the facts as a jumping off point.
Julie, I think you had some concerns both about how fully the character of Song Liuling was developed, and, well, I'll stop there. And you were able to use the actual events to sort of find more material that you wanted to explore, is that right?
Yeah, I think in the original, and this is, I've read it a year ago when we started to work, but I think the difference between the Song Liuling character then and now is that it's more of a revenge story. I don't see the original as a love story at all. I don't. I see it as the spy, Song Liuling, was very early on knowing exactly what he was doing and disguised himself to be able to do the things he needed to do as a spy. And at the end, the reversal felt more like triumph. And I'm being very simplistic now because it's complicated. And as I read not just the real story, elements of the real story, because these characters have nothing to do with the real people, really. The part that Clive is playing is older than the real person, but he also has a wife. He's much higher level diplomat. There's all kinds of things that this is a completely fresh new character that David created and that Clive has honed. So the thing about Song, to me, is that he doesn't betray. We don't all agree necessarily, you have to understand that. I don't think that Song betrays Gallimard. I don't think so, because I see that right from the very first scene, he doesn't say that he's a man. He's bemused that Gallimard says, "Mademoiselle," and he goes, "Mademoiselle, how charming." You know what I mean? Ah, okay. Plays along with it. And right there in the second scene, he takes off his female makeup from the Peking Opera, and he's got the Mao suit on, and never ever says that he's a woman. When he has to start to lie is when he's already fallen in love. And he realizes, this is my interpretation, he realizes that Gallimard can only live in this fantasy world. He's recognized the romantic, and Song is a romantic. And you know, this is what David and I had fun with this, because we would go back and forth and we don't have to agree. I have to believe in the full dimensionality of the characters in order to direct them, in order to talk to actors. So for me, I have to understand Song in the way that I can't see it as a type. I can't see him as, oh, a spy. No, what is motivating him? He had no choice about spying. There's no homosexuality in China. He's interrogated and put into a prison camp. Then he's interrogated again when he comes to France. And when he does remove his clothes, he finally feels this is a moment of complete freedom, and then he is betrayed. He is betrayed by the freedom of the West concept, and he's betrayed by this man. So it's a tragedy, it's a double tragedy. And then we have a very big disagreement, right, on Gallimard.
Which one?
Right.
Oh, okay.
Gallimard. Because I also have tremendous empathy for that character, where you should.
Well, no, Julie and I have, I think, had a very, we've had a good collaboration, and we do argue, but it's always been a really productive argument. I feel like Julie pulls towards the kind of emotional nuances of the relationship, and I pull towards the sort of Breckian political, sociological message of the play. And of course, you need both, which is why I think we've had a good collaboration. And I hesitate to say anything about not being sympathetic to Gallimard in front of the actor playing
Well, why don't we
we'll
talk,
put that one away.
Let's talk to the actor playing Gallimard. How did you go about finding this character?
Well, it's interesting when you were talking about, you know, I obviously went to the book and I was fascinated by the book, and there's some amazing stuff in the book. But I do think that film and theatre it's a practical thing. You play the play. You have to have the material there. You can't be a whole world. You just have what is in front of you, and you have to be practical. I've worked with directors on films where they'll talk to you for an hour about the world of the character, and then you go, that's great. Where is it on the page? I've got to do it. You know, it's a practical thing. But it was an interesting experience, this one, because, you know, it is based on a real guy, and it was a very healthy fusion, it seemed to me, because the play is its own animal, and there are things that are very, very different from the real story. But I was inspired and carried by the real person and the real story. And there were big, strong elements that carried me through my thinking and through my approach to it, which are based on the real guy. And they could be applied into this very different, more theatrical story that, you know, wasn't all totally true and based on fact. And it felt like a healthy fusion. And even still, as I play the part, I do have the real person there, and I think about what he went through, of how you know, the first time you ever talk about the play, people say, how could he not know?
Right.
He didn't want to know. And it's a story about somebody who is so prepared to go so far to delude themselves because they want something so badly. And every relationship, to a certain extent, makes a deal where you make things that work for yourself, and you might be in denial about other things, but you make a world that works for yourself. This is one of the most extreme, extraordinary versions of that I've ever read. But he did do it. They did do it. He was interviewed in prison and said, no, and they said, it's not, like, he went that far, and he believed it. And ultimately, you know, ridiculed and vilified. Why are we so upset? He wanted to create that world. He created that world, and we find it very difficult.
And also, what I think is beautiful in David's play is that even at the end of the first act, he does know. You know, he wants to strip song, but he stops because somewhere, and he speaks this quite directly to the audience, he says, I put that aside, I put that away. I don't have the words, but where you can know something, but if you put it into another box over here, you can pretend it doesn't exist. And that I find also very moving, because that leads me to believe that he actually did love the person, even though at the end it's a big struggle. But we tried, and I think this got added to this new version, where they talk about records, they talk about music, they talk about the old days, they talk about cappuccinos, tuxedos, and martinis, whatever. But there's a part of China that existed before the Cultural Revolution, and that is the Peking opera part of song that is so detailed and exquisite and refined and old and beautiful and mysterious. What I loved when Clive came a year ago to my apartment, and we all sat, and he kept talking and showing pictures of the guy with the fur coat. He kept saying, I want to wear the fur coat. Can I wear the coat with the fur collar?
For reasons. It wasn't just that I like the fur.
It was cold in New York. No. But you were really excited also by this romantic adventurer. This guy, the real guy, seemed to be an adventurer and a romantic. And so what David added to the script is his description of going to the Peking Opera when there is no white guy going, being the only one, or down these streets and these alleyways to Song's apartment. That had an exciting and romantic and dangerous aspect. He lived in that. So what you find out is when everybody says, well, how could he not know, because we think of the sex. But for both of these people, it wasn't about the sex. That was not what was important. And that's what's so touching in the scene where you have Song have to be very graphically express how did he do it. And that's based upon the real testimony, as graphic as it is. It's not something that was just put in there.
Because so much of the relationship, you know, it's not about the body parts.
No.
It's about the sort of fantasy world that they're creating for themselves, and how that gets violated towards the end of the play. So that the sort of more prurient interest questions about, well, what were the physical mechanics of how they have sex? So, you know, we sort of put it into the trial scene, and the judge in France sort of forces Sung Li Lin to come up with a description, and it's very graphic, and at the end of it, you still can't figure out how they did it, because it's not about that.
No, it's not.
Clive, what was the sort of scariest thing for you about this role? What was the biggest challenge in taking this on?
I mean, I do tend to sort of get attracted to, you know, it's a very challenging part in terms of taking people through the story, because, you know, ultimately I do feel, you know, it is based on a real guy. There's a kind of responsibility to try, and I love to take on parts that are a difficult journey, that aren't easy, because that's, to me, is where the most exciting work is. It's where I can sort of do the most. And tracking this story and where this guy gets to, and getting to a point where you don't have to like the guy, you don't have to, you just have to understand how a man could get to this point by the end of the play. And I feel that, with this character, it was challenging, and I like to play challenging parts. I think he's also a character full of conflict, and if I look through all my career, I'm always looking for that as an actor. I think that's where drama is. Somebody who's torn, someone who's struggling with something. That's where you can get to the sort of heart of what life is about. And this is a character who is kind of, deluding himself and struggling and in conflict, and that just appealed to me.
You referred to deluding yourself. The character is also in some ways deluding the audience. The character breaks the fourth wall and is a sort of unreliable narrator. Is that a difficult thing to play?
It probably is the most challenging thing, yeah. And also the fact that you tell the story and then you enter into the scenes and you're playing the scenes as they were experienced at the time, but ultimately it's all being driven by somebody who has hindsight, who is aware, and calibrating that is probably the most challenging thing of playing the part, I think.
David and Julie, I wanted to ask you about your collaboration. You've alluded several times to a kind of degree of contentiousness.
No.
No?
No.
Yeah, it was
No, I wouldn't.
We had healthy debates.
It's just
Healthy
debates. Yeah.
So David, did you go off by yourself to rewrite this, or did you do it together, or how did you figure out how to do the revisions?
No, we would talk about things, and we would either be around your kitchen tables, occasionally, sometimes with Clive, or I'd come up to your place in the country. Sorry, and we would, and then we talk about it, and then I'd go home and do a rewrite. I mean, it was always just very
Back and forth.
Yeah.
But we also, when David first did it, he had told me that it was a very fast process. They did it in Washington, D.C. There were no readings, there were no workshops. It got the good and the bad reviews, and then it moved to Broadway, and there
also
wasn't...
got the good and the bad reviews.
Yeah, and there wasn't time for him to hear it, work it, so I said, this was part of what was great about Clive. We were supposed to do it last spring, and Clive asked if we could postpone it to the fall so that he would have more time between whatever projects, because he wanted to live with it longer. So we were able to arrange that this Broadway cast, and Clive would do a workshop, a 29-hour, about 4-day workshop in the spring, where David would be able to work on it in the workshop and hear it from the mouths and the talent of the people that we had cast. And I think that a lot of work happened then, a lot of ideas, a lot of, it was just a spectacularly intimate, wonderful time for the writer to hear his work and go home and come back again. So there was rewriting then, there was writing, then rewriting, and then we also, during rehearsal, he comes in and out whenever I want him to or whether he wants to come. So it's a very open relationship that way with the writer. It's fantastic.
But I would say a huge amount of work got done in that those 4 days.
Yeah.
Because we were just focused on the script.
Mm-hmm.
I want to talk a little about the staging. Can we look at the next photo? So
I look good there, don't I?
Yeah. You mean that guy up there on the top?
Julie, I think you have this idea of an ideograph, and I'm not sure I fully understand it, but I think you try to reduce each show to a visual concept. Can you talk about how you approached this one and what the concept is and how you got there?
Well, I believe as a director and for actors, but also for the set design, that you should try and, if you can, abstract all of it into a few brushstrokes. It's like if you were to take The Lion King, it's the easiest one for me to do. You know that the circle is the ideograph. From the circle of life to the sun, to Mufasa's big headdress, to the way Pride Rock, in the movie it just goes out like that. But in the way that we did it, Richard Hudson, the designer, it circles out. So it's in the wheels of the gazelle wheel. It's all the way through that play. So what would the ideograph be for this play? I knew that Eiko Ishioka's set, which was so magnificent in the original, it was very operatic. It was it was a big swirling staircase, or not a staircase, but a ramp that came down. But it wasn't depicting each scene. And David, who calls himself non-visual, without any fear at all, writes
and Julie totally agrees.
37 scene changes in the first act or something. And I thought, well, it was very cinematic, and so I thought, okay, where does this play begin? It begins in a cell. It begins and ends in a prison cell, and I never really felt that in the original. I was sort of surprised when I read the script. So the ideograph idea for this was almost this, it's like a puzzle box, a Chinese puzzle box. So it appears to be one little square, but we come at it on the corner there. And it keeps expanding. And what David wrote are, you know, the audience, what is the audience? Who is he talking to? I mean, we never really talk about that, but he is telling the story because he's gone through so much humiliation from the public that now he wants his ideal audience to hear the version that he believes in, and he hasn't been able to get to the end yet. So what you've got are these flashbacks, projections, dreams, what else would you say?
Sort of some meta Pirandellan, you know.
Moments. And so the idea of this box was done with screens. What you're seeing there on that thing up there are 6 by 12 foot screens, and we have, I don't know, 37, 40, I don't know how many we have actually. And they're double-sided, and there's no automation. It's all hand done. Like it or not, wobbly or not, it's done by human beings, and therefore it has the life of humanity in it. And they're able to form all kinds of shapes, all kinds, very quickly. They can go from one scene to another, to another, to another. So it's his mind that opens up. Like the first time we go from metal to full-out color and imagery is the first time he meets song. So there has to be a reason, always has to be a reason. The technology is the meaning. The meaning is in the technology. There's a reason why you open up to that color then. There is a reason why just his wife's apartment is just a piece of wallpaper and a lamp that's of a type. But Song's apartment is fully realized because that's his world. That's the world where he feels free and full. So we started making a real puzzle box and got really exhausted after the 7th scene. And we dropped it and went to these screens that are manipulated by stagehands and the actors.
You mentioned The Lion King earlier, and it seems to me that there's a parallel there in the kind of the visibleness of the human element of theater making that the audience is watching. You are simultaneously aware and unaware that there are people making art in front of you. Is that an intentional approach?
Yes, I'm like all of us. We do film and television. And so when I do theater, it's not that I haven't used high technology or projections, but there was something about this play that needed to be raw and visceral. And that if I used projections or something that was more automated like that, you would lose the intimacy and the sweat and the blood and the personalness and personality and personal being of it. So as funky as it may be from time to time, it felt like the right choice. And also, I've spent a lot of time in Asia. Indonesia, I was there 4 years in my 20s. So Japanese and Indonesian theater forms where you see the operators, you know, if you've seen The Lion King, and if you haven't, where are you? But but at any rate, you're very aware. You know, people, you're not trying to hide the artifice. In fact, the poetry, the sheer poetry of theater is the exposing of the rods, the strings, and the artifice. And watching those things and people moving them, I think that theater does that. Film and television can't do that. They do blue screen, you know, they try and hide it all. It has to look real. And theater has fallen into a trap with projections, I do believe, and the reality of the living room, the kitchen, of trying to compete with other mediums that do it better, like television. So when we have the opportunity to use theater techniques and theater forms to tell a story, it invites the audience to fill in the blanks. The audience feels they don't need all that detail. In Toulon's office, you just need his incredible lacquered and the plexiglass walls and you need the kind of the sharp edges of that office there. And that's the environment that the character comes in. You don't need too many other things in the room. So there is a minimalism and a maximalism. And something like the Peking opera moments, which I don't know if you have pictures of that, but which have these giant faces of Peking opera masks up on these walls, and then very detailed costumes. That's this lush world. And that world with Elliot's music and the live percussion is very, very filled in. And then there are other moments when he's on stage and we get rid of everything and it's just an empty stage. And I love to play, as I did with The Lion King and other shows, where it's like a long shot and a close-up. It's the theatrical version of that kind of thing, where you strip things away and you focus it. And you have to play with that balance. That is, as a director, that is not, you're directing the actors, but you're also directing the focus of the audience and the experience. So if you have something that's really vital and lush, the next scene might have to be very, very small and intimate.
Speaking of small and intimate, I wanted to ask you and Clive about the opening. It's wordless, and it's René Gallimard in the prison cell. And there are these kind of strobe lighty flashes of Clive in different positions in the cell. I gather you think of that as a kind of overture. Can you talk about developing those moments and what that was like physically, and how you sort of how you made that happen?
Do you want to start? No.
You start.
Okay. So David had language for the cell, a description of the cell. And I said that I would like to cut that down to the bare minimum and do it wordlessly. And what you have is that you have this 6 by 6 foot wall cell, metal walls, and a light bulb. And I was inspired, really, I wanted to get this feeling when he says night after night, I tell this story, that we could get the passage of time by showing the character in these positions and the sound of the past and these images through sound that are invading his head. So, and we talked about Francis Bacon paintings and Butoh, and so working with Clive, he went through various positions, sometimes with the chair. There's only one chair. It's just a metal chair. And so you'll see him, and the bulb goes up, and then it goes down, and he's in another position. So you get 4 or 5 of these different ones, and finally a moth attracted to the light bulb comes, and that throws him into the butterfly, the moth. And you hear fragments. It's a soundscape that Eliot created of the real thing, of feet going by the prison door, you know, the guards and the jangling of keys, or you might hear distant Peking opera or Puccini, Madame Butterfly, and laughter. And so these are the things that are tormenting him. And I think it got the passage of time. And Clive and I talked about this is partly a mental breakdown, this entire journey that he's taking. And song is invading his head and saying, you cannot tell this story without telling my version of the story. So those silver metal walls, those steel walls, they show up. They're always there. You always see the chair there. The chair never leaves, he never leaves the stage. Once for 5 seconds, 10 seconds?
5.
5. So what about your feeling about that?
What are those moments like for you?
No, it felt to me important. Having read the book, I mean, the real guy was in a pretty awful state when he was in prison, and he attempted suicide in prison, and obviously his world came crashing down. It was kind of the ultimate humiliation. His life, his world, he'd lived this extraordinary life of sort of fantasizing. He was a total romantic, and this was as far away from romance as you could get. He was sort of ridiculed and vilified, and so it for me it feels very good and very anchoring to begin and end the play with the reality of that, and then we can do whatever and then try and express this extraordinary story, and a lot of the stuff in the play that is great didn't really happen, but for me, it was important it was a very centering thing to go back to that and realize that this did happen,
Right. Why don't we look, you mentioned the Peking opera. I think that the next slide shows an image from that. So I know one of the discoveries for this particular show was of a Chinese opera that's a sort of counterpoint to the Puccini. Can you talk about finding that and integrating it and why it's significant?
So Xu Peipu, the actual Chinese spy, was a Chinese opera performer and performed in an opera which was a Yue opera called Butterfly Lovers. Butterfly Lovers is a pretty ancient Chinese story, but only became a Chinese opera relatively recently in the 20th century. And it is, of course, it is also an opera with butterfly in the title, and it happens to concern gender confusion. And so this was an example of something like, I don't think either taking something from the real story, you don't do it just because it's from the real story. But if something from the real story happens to dovetail with a larger point that you're trying to make in the show, then it becomes doubly useful. And in this case, Butterfly Lovers became a sort of Chinese counterpoint to Madame Butterfly in a version where we were trying to bring out more of Sung Li-ling, of the Chinese point of view in this story. So it allowed us to kind of have a better balance and bring this story, which is very important in Chinese culture, into this play.
Let's look at the final photo. So one of the things that was most shocking about this play originally was the way it dealt with what we now think of as gender identity. I don't even think that was a phrase we were using then. How has the shift in the way that we talk about sexuality and sort of gender spectrums affected the way that people are perceiving and engaging with this show?
You know, so much of the original play turned on, as Julie was saying, on the reveal of the Sung Li-ling character's true gender. And the shock of that was very powerful 30 years ago. And honestly, I don't think it's so shocking today. And therefore, what did that give us? Well, it maybe gave us an opportunity to begin to look at this relationship more as a real relationship as opposed to the more sensationalistic aspects. Mm-hmm. And so one of the aspects of the true story that, again, dovetailed with our purposes was the idea that the French diplomat initially thought that his lover, or that Xu Peipu was a man. And then Xu Peipu told him a story that allowed him to believe that, that he was actually a woman. So, you know, this is both, I think, more complicated and feels more consistent with the way we look at gender today, which is less binary, which is more fluid, and we're more aware of the wider range of gender expression. So it seemed to, again, fulfill two purposes.
And it was rather extraordinary when we were going back into the research. I said, did you know about this Butterfly Lovers? And he said, no, of course not, because he didn't know much of the history of these characters. Well, Butterfly Lovers, just very quickly, is like a Shakespearean, it's like a Twelfth Night. It's like one of the Shakespearean plays where very quickly, a young woman many ages ago wants to study, and of course, being a woman, she's not allowed, and her stupid brother gets to go to school. So her brother says, you wear my clothes, you go ahead. So she disguises herself as her brother, goes off to study, and becomes best friends with another young scholar who doesn't know that he is a she. And of course, she falls in love with him, or they get very, very close. Then her parents bring her home and wed her off to a rich merchant or farmer. And she's heartbroken because she wanted to sort of somehow be able to tell the scholar friend that she was really a woman, and that's why they felt close. So she sends a lock of her hair, and he dies, the scholar, young scholar. And on her way to her wedding, she comes to his gravesite, and lightning and thunder, and the stone breaks, and she falls into the tomb, and two butterflies come out, forever united. And then Shi Pei-pu said to the real guy, "That's my story. This is the real stuff. This is the history. This is the real story. That's my story." He said, the reason you're feeling this is because I actually was born a girl, but my father wanted a boy, and there were 2 or 3 other sisters, and so my parents decided to disguise me as a boy, reared me as a boy, and that's why everybody else here, I have to live as a boy, but you saw me. You saw the real me. And I think what's so contemporary about this, and what I love about now having that version in the play, is that is who Song Li-ling is. Song Li-ling is a man who's happy with his penis, happy that he has his body. He's not trying to transgender himself, but he is both. And in the love for the man that he wants, I mean, we would say he's a homosexual, but he is Song Li-ling. And that I think is the discussion that makes this play so exciting right now, is that it doesn't matter what he is actually. These two human beings were so interconnected, they had so much to share, but the societies, the Chinese Communist Society on the one hand, and the French, whatever you want to call it, society on the other, would not allow that kind of relationship to exist. So you wonder if that were today, can that exist? Can it? I mean, it's not the two people who fell apart. It wasn't that they fell out of love. It was the conditions, the societal conditions that made this relationship not work. So that again wasn't David or myself trying to update this play. It was there. He had started it, and it just fell out in the more that we looked into it.
Clive, I want to ask you about that relationship, but then we're going to turn to questions from the audience. So if people want to line up in the aisles, you can ask questions.
Line up in the aisles.
So Clive, so you're playing a character of sort of ambiguous sexuality who falls in love with a character of sort of ambiguous gender, played by Jin Ha. How did you go about developing that relationship?
Well, it helps that Jin is a really fantastic actor. That was a big help. So that we just, we work through it. I mean, ultimately, I think for me that I think that he, the character is wants something so badly and is prepared to believe, is prepared to commit and believe extraordinary things because he wants something so badly, but he's also in denial about other things. I mean, the challenge of the part is that, he deludes himself, and you have to, ultimately that's what he does, and ultimately his world comes crashing down at the end.
Right. I'm going to ask you all to form questions in the form of questions, and we'll start right here.
I've bought tickets and seen the show twice. I want you to know I only want to see it again. I pray I can. I want to say first, I did not know the story when I saw it. After seeing the opera Madame Butterfly, I said, I never want to see Madame Butterfly again. And yet I wanted to see this story. I want you also to know that the first time those panels start flipping around on the stage, I thought was the most exciting thing in the whole world. I love the panels. And what no one has really talked about is the enormous sensitivity in which the roles are played, the gentleness of the love story of how you treat your co-actor, who is sensational. That young boy who I can't believe is new to the stage, he was sensational. But the gentleness and the emotion that you show between the two of you is lovely and wonderful, and I really hope I get to see it again.
Thank you.
You can.
You should get her a ticket.
Yeah.
You can have a ticket after that, come on.
Sure.
I will ask a question. So the question is for Clive. You said, and it's true, that you do roles that are challenging. From your perspective, when you're handling a role, comparing the stage, which is what you do, what we see, that's what we get, with a district chief inspector going bad vision, losing his vision, where the visuals that Julie would bring to bear are there helping us understand what he's seeing or not seeing. How do you compare what it takes to convey on the stage? It's out there, only you can convey what the character is, with television or film, where so much other contributes to what your character is doing, where you seem, maybe, and this is the question, not to have that much to do, because the fiction and the technology is helping us see the character.
It's, I mean, I came into acting through the theatre. I did a school play and I fell in love with theatre and ended up sort of doing an awful lot of plays when I was young, and I left it. They are very, very different disciplines. For me, I think the starting point is always the same. I navigate my way through the character in exactly the same way. I have to sort of understand and calibrate and do all the things that I would do. It's just the discipline of actually doing the job is very, very different. Film is very, very specific. It's much more a director's medium and an editor's medium, and an actor on film is there to offer up and trust that the person that you're working with understands what you're trying to do and is on that journey with you. It's very, very specific. It's, shooting out of sequence. It's about being aware of the whole thing and being able to calibrate on the move, changing, doing this. Theatre is a much more live animal. The energy required is much different. You have to fill a space. When I started in the theatres, they weren't mic'd at all. And it was like, so you had to come and your energy had to fill the space and communicate to everybody. And you still have to do that, even though you're mic'd. You still have to reach out to people. I kidded myself that you had your days free, because you don't. Because from the minute I wake up, I have a kind of train coming at me, and I know at a certain time I have to be ready and available and up for it. And there are times literally where I wake up, I go for a walk, and I go, I'm not well, I need to get checked out. There's something, and I realize what it is, and this is serious. I actually am switching myself off in the daytime, because I know I have not got the energy to waste in the daytime doing things, so I have to be ready at that point, and it's physically very, very demanding. So they're different, but ultimately, the commitment to the part and the commitment to playing the truth of something is exactly the same impetus.
Thanks. I would love to take a question from you, but I think you have to use a microphone so people can hear you, or I can repeat it. I'll repeat it. Hang on, we've got a question here, and if I can get you to use a microphone, that would be great. I'm going to exempt you.
When you're creating, like, the costumes, do you do a meditation? Does it come through you? Does it come through as a vision? Or do you do it piece by piece and develop?
All right, so we have a question up front about the development of costume design for this show, how that came about, and whether there's a single inspiration or it comes...
I'm not the designer of the costumes.
Right.
Oh, Lion King. Is that appropriate?
Well, I guess we should pause to acknowledge that last night was the 20th anniversary of The Lion King.
Yeah.
Congratulations. And I think it's fair to say that you have strong ideas, even if you didn't do the costume design for this show.
I
so
do. I
maybe you
worked
could
with
talk a little about
the
how
costumes
you,
for
yes.
this. Yeah. Well, Constance Hoffman, who is the costume designer, and I've worked together. When I don't design it, she's pretty much been the designer. So we've done 4 or 5 shows together. And I think in this one, because it appears more naturalistic, obviously there's period clothing, but we talk about color palette. You know, color palette, this idea of the ideograph, the color palette says a lot about the characters. So the kind of pastels, and I hate to say this, but the sort of sickly greens of his wife, you know, they just felt right. And
Don't tell Enid that, will you?
Don't tell Enid. Please,
That's
don't tell her. But you know, we'd spent a long time on him because he's on stage and he doesn't go off, so he can't change. So what would he wear? What color would it be? This kind of blue that could it's a blue suit, sort of like what he's wearing. And how much, you know, going through the transformation of that character, but maintaining, we went through a point where he actually did change when we moved to Paris, and we thought, it's unnecessary. Again, he's really telling this story all at the same time. So playing it as if now we're in real flashbacks going back to these times, we threw that out the window. And we knew that the real kind of colorful costumes would be the Peking Opera, which are a combination of costumes from China and costumes that Constance designed to balance those and make them into quick changes. I mean, these characters, not him, he doesn't have to go off stage and change, but Jin changes costume 10 or 15 times, and makeup. And so do the dancers, like a musical. So I think the color palette is how Constance and Don Holder, the lighting designer, we all work on that. So there's this kind of, we looked at the period of the 1960s, the Jackie Kennedy, you know, the metallic golds and silvers and in these pastel colors, and carried that through the embassy characters. And then you have the Cultural Revolution, which is the army costumes. I mean, we were inspired from the real period photographs.
Great. Yes.
Thanks. First, I want to thank each of you for coming here tonight and for giving us a play that is incredibly thought-provoking, touching, and memorable. What I want to direct my question to is the very end of the play, when Gallimard is putting on the face makeup and ultimately tries to commit suicide. What do you, as the playwright, director, actor, want the audience to interpret from that?
Well, my original notion, and this goes back to the 30 years ago version of the play, is that he realizes at the end of the play that it's he who's actually Butterfly. And I think what that means in a larger sense is that, and this is where I guess I feel like it's not, Julie and I have a little difference on this, in that I feel that it's not necessarily that their romance doesn't work out because it was 1986 or whatever. I feel that Gallimard is caught in a fantasy where he's of sort of the Madame Butterfly story, that he is the sort of Western savior. We have a line in the play now about, you know, men, you're like the rest of them who would rather destroy the world than see outside the limits of your own mind. And I think we see so much of that actually in our contemporary world and our American political situation today. But so he essentially really wants this Madame Butterfly figure to exist. And once he can no longer attach it to the body that is Sung Li Ling, he decides to take it on himself.
Great. Does either of you want to weigh in on the ending?
Sure. David had originally written that the character does the Japanese, like you see in some of the image of Madame Butterfly, the seppuku, the classical. It's written actually with the stagehands in a Japanese style coming on with the makeup and the knife and it's very ritualistic. And I think that, again, this has to do with the cell and reality, and also talking to Clive about it. I came up with the idea of the mirror that he's, first of all, that he would be putting it on himself, that he needed. I didn't want the extras in there. I didn't want the formality of that, and also to have other people in the cell. They just couldn't be there. So he would have to do that. It's everything that David's saying. He would put it on himself as he's describing the sacrifice that needs to happen for mistakes made. And he talks about love, the mistake. And then this image I had of that he would look at himself and smash the mirror, because he smashes it on the word nothing but a man, right? Is that what it is? Yeah, the man. And that what he would kill himself with would be that reflection of himself. You know, okay, I'm talking like metaphorically and all, but he does break a mirror. He does pick up the piece of the mirror, and the messiness, and we got into this idea that it was messy, the makeup's messy, how he kills himself is messy, and that death would have a real kind of graphic and shocking. That is a shocking moment. I never saw the blood for the first 5 performances, and I kept saying, put your neck up, I can't see the blood. He said, the blood is there. But, you know, and then what we did was with the arrival of song, because the ending is not just the death of Gallimard, it's like Madame Butterfly, where the song character comes in and says, butterfly, butterfly, which is what happens in Madame Butterfly, only it's Pinkerton coming to Butterfly. And the idea that we would carry through from the moth to the 2 butterflies in the Peking opera to this man's song falling over his dead lover, the man he loved, and that the 2 white butterflies from Butterfly Lovers now we're joining the 2 operas together. The Butterfly Lovers, which are all made of light, the images of light, and they would separate. They were not going like this. They were actually, the tragedy of them is that they start out together and then they end off on each corner, leaving. So that's how we got to that specific action and the way that Clive does the.
I hope we haven't spoiled the end.
Yeah.
That's a problem. That's what happens. I say don't tell the story ahead of time, but spoiler alerts.
Yes.
I was curious about the process for casting the role of Song Li Lin, because it's such a pivotal role and so important, the gender neutrality, the tenderness, and yet strong at the same time. Curious as to whether you auditioned 100 people or if you knew you wanted Jin right away. Did you know immediately when he auditioned that's the person?
Well, we did audition, I don't know how many, but probably 50 to 75 a lot. I was in Korea, I auditioned people in Korea. We had people from China audition. We had people from Philippines, Taiwan, so tapes would come in. I went to LA. And then right here, back home, Jin Ha, well, he was actually in Chicago doing Hamilton. He had just graduated, yeah, exactly. He just graduated NYU the year before, went right into Hamilton, into the ensemble, understudied Hamilton, Burr, and King George. And I first saw an audition tape of his, and Clive was in the States at the time, so there was a wonderful countertenor that we also loved, who came over to audition for us, and that was very exciting, the idea of having a countertenor opera singer who really could sing the Madame Butterfly, because at the time, I didn't know if Jin could sing like that. I didn't know it till after he was cast that he had studied opera and that he could actually sing in that pitch. So I wanted to make sure, even though he couldn't see him live, I wanted to make sure that Clive saw who we would be partnering with. And you had a feeling when you saw the tape, it was...
Yeah, just straight away. I mean, as the lady said, the character has to be both, has to be incredibly sensitive and delicate, but also very, very strong. And I could just see very clearly that Jin was a really, really fine actor. He's very young, but he's really fine. And it's important, for me to play Gallimard, to really fall for this person and be led by this person. And he's much, much younger and, hasn't got a lot of experience, but it was very, very easy to do that with him because he's already a very fine actor.
I want to ask you, we have some questions from people who are watching on Facebook Live. Jacqueline asks about, and I guess, David, this is primarily for you, about the role of this play in creating opportunities for Asian Americans in the world of theater. The New York Times had run a series of interviews with Asian American writers and performers who talked about the influence that this play had on their careers. Can you talk a little about how you see the place of this play?
Right. Well, I'm going to answer that question to some extent by extending on the Jin Ha question, because it's such a difficult part. But it has been my experience 30 years ago and today and through all the intervening years and with whatever roles that I've written, that if you create the part, that you will find the actor who can do it. And there are amazing actors of color out there, amazing Asian actors who are not getting enough opportunities. And so in some sense, it's an advantage to be able to create these great parts because you have to look a little harder, but you will find someone who's going to be amazing at it. And yeah, just in terms of the overall legacy of the play, I mean, there are fantastic young Asian American writers right now. Most of them have not yet been produced on Broadway, but that they're being produced off-Broadway, they're being produced around the country, and they will make it to Broadway.
Yeah, I think that this spring, the first Broadway play by an Asian American woman is going to be
Young Jane
on
Lee's
Broadway.
play.
It's kind of amazing, 2017. Clive, this is for you from Aylin on Facebook Live. How did seeing opera singers at the Royal Opera House guide your process and acting in the play?
Well, I was lucky. It was on in London, the opera, and I hadn't seen it, so I went to see it, and then I put in a cheeky request because I heard that they were going through some recasting rehearsals. Could I go in to the rehearsal room? I was just, I just wanted to sort of soak up the opera, and I was hugely impressed, I've got to say, and it had quite an effect on me. There was something. I'm not a big opera buff. I've been to the opera a number of times, but there is something about the clarity of intent with powerful opera singers that I find really thrilling. It's just so clear what the intent is, and I sat there as an actor thinking I could learn some things from these people.
Yes.
I think they made everything visually, they created the atmosphere. So I disagreed with the reviews that didn't like them. To me, they made a lot. And I'm very happy that I came here today to hear you talk about the things that, for months, I saw the play months ago, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. And I saw other plays and operas and ballets in the meantime, and magic happens and wonderful things happens, and you walk out and you love them, but then on to the next thing, right? But this play, I just couldn't stop thinking about, because there were things that I loved so much, and there were things that I disagreed so strongly about, some points of view, right? That I kept thinking about it, which is a wonderful thing, I think, because that's what art is supposed to do. So to me, everybody asked, what do you think? And I said, it doesn't matter what I think this, but you have to go and see. So a lot of what you said today clarified for me my questions, right? But when I was watching it, it felt like a little bit schizophrenic, because I think that I saw the different points of view of each of you within the play. And it's something very new, because usually you see one vision, more or less. That's what I'm used to. So this was, for me, the first time when I saw such different points of view within the play of a person who was playing Gallimard, and then I saw Miss Taymor's view, and then I also saw the playwright's view. And so I have two questions, really. There is a yes.
When did you see the play?
There is so I love that Mr. Owen saw. Okay, the question. Well, it's not so simple. So, okay. When there's a scene when they meet, right? And Clive said that it's definitely a choice that a person makes to fall in love that way, to not see anything, right? And there's a very definite moment where we make that choice. So I saw, and I also saw in that scene, I'm sorry, I have to explain this.
No.
I also saw in that scene Ms. Taymor's point of view, where you know, the Chinese opera singer builds up that whole thing, builds up, you know, builds up a very powerful moment where he.
I'm sorry. Do you have a question?
Yes, I do. So my question is, in that scene, I saw the Chinese opera guy guilt tripping the European, you know, like using guilt in a very powerful way to sort of like create that relationship, establish a stronghold in that relationship, like establish a strong hand. Sorry.
Oh, okay. I'm going to have to cut you off. I'm sorry, but
okay.
we're running out of time.
It's an episode of Curb Your Enthusiasm.
Not my first language, but no. I really want to. Okay, I wanted to ask
about what?
About guilt.
Okay, that's great. Why don't we pause there and let's just talk about the role of guilt in the play. Does any of you want to weigh in on the sort of sense of guilt that Gallimard does or does not feel?
No, not Gallimard. Is that
The Chinese guilt. Okay.
I mean,
David.
Yes.
Oh.
So what I will say is that I feel like one of the methods of the play is that it does try to look at these different issues, look at these different points of view, and the varying points of view of the characters in many different ways. So it's almost like examining kind of a prism, and we see it one way, and then we see it another way, and we see it another way. And so the sort of competing points of view in the play, I think also reflect things that are necessary for the play to work. And when I talked about Julie tending to pull towards the nuance in the romantic relationship, and I tended to pull more towards the sort of political points of view, it's really that there are many different facets through which we examine this story, some of which are opposed to each other, but hopefully you end up with a much more kind of global way of looking at this very complicated relationship.
I want to close by just asking you all to reflect for a second on the place of plays on Broadway these days. You've all been at this a long time. You've done a lot of prominent work. There's been a lot of discussion about whether there's still room for plays on Broadway or whether musicals have just sort of taken over the real estate. What do you see as the future for plays in this environment?
You know, the original production of M. Butterfly ran about 2 years, and I think that's hard to do nowadays. The plays that seem to be able to have a life on Broadway are those that do have a pretty complicated visual life. So if you think about War Horse, or if you think about Curious Incident of the Dog, and of course we have Harry Potter coming to Broadway this season. So in some sense, I think the line between plays and musicals is becoming a little more blurry for plays that generally have more commercial success. But I don't know, you know, this season, between our show and of course, you know, there's the revival of Angels, there's like some, and I think plays may end up being very prominent this season.
Great. And why don't I let that be the last word? I want to thank all of you. I want to thank people watching on Facebook Live, and I want to thank all of you for being here. Thank you.